The Incentive to Innovate: The Behavior of Local Policymakers in China. A paper by Jessica Tietz, Riza Hazmath, and Orion Lewis. Section 1, Introduction. Studies of a single-party state bureaucracies predict that local officials act as bureaucrats and are unlikely to engage in uncertain and risky policy innovation. In the Chinese context, policy experimentation is a notable political gamble, since local officials usually have terms less than 3 years, which is often not long enough to show results. Moreover, innovation is risky since officials do not know if the results will be positive or negative. Policy change that is seen as causing negative outcomes might cause the officials to lose his or her position. However, even with this uncertainty and risk, we observe a great deal of policy innovation at the subnational level in contemporary China, including pilot programs to change the household registration system, village and township level elections, and social welfare programs. At a macro level, the rapid economic growth experienced by China over the last 3 decades can be credited to policy innovation and experimentation. Studies local policy entrepreneurship to incentives in the evaluation system used to promote officials, namely through the policy innovation imperative, whereby the careers of local officials have become increasingly dependent on local policy innovations. In effect, the central government has added incentives to innovate in the evaluation system to overcome the Weberian warning of bureaucratic inertia. Despite the positive role in economic reforms and regime durability, there has been a reduction in policy experimentation under Xi Jinping's administration due to a re-centralization under the slogan of top-level design and the ongoing anti-corruption campaign. As Stepan argues, centralizing all new policy design risks to stifle innovation and to decrease effective governance. Local officials struggle to interpret central directives and live in fear of retribution for veering off the officially sanctioned path. The ongoing anti-corruption campaign is omnipresent and has led to paralysis on the local level. In support of this analysis, Chen and Gobel analyze a database of applications for the National Government Innovation Award, and the authors find that innovation has declined dramatically under Xi Jinping, and that the remaining policy experiments tend to focus more on a social policy and less on political reforms. For example, after a high of over 100 reported cases in 2008, policy experiments cases until 2013. When President Xi took power, and then the reported cases dropped to below 10. Although changes at the central level are clearly filtering down to local officials, we find variation in policy experimentation as evident by the cases analyzed in the articles in this special issue, in policy areas such as transportation and e-government. Despite the overall trend of decreased innovation, these cases contribute to local variation that might create nuances or scope conditions necessary for understanding the differing outcomes across China. In short, the puzzle motivating this study is to understand how local officials in China filter the institutional changes ushered in by the Xi Jinping regime, to the extent of observed variations in local policy innovation. Using empirical evidence gathered from non-randomized, semi-structured interviews with policy actors in Beijing, Zhejiang, and Shenzhen in the second half of 2016, this study looks at variations in local policy actors' preferences to experiment and innovate, and analyzes the interactions between these preferences and their incentive structures. We selected Beijing as it is the location of several policy institutes and government think tanks that engage with policy innovation, and speculate that Beijing, as the seat of the central government, may present unique challenges to Zhejiang and Shenzhen are 2 subnational jurisdictions with the highest number of policy experiments, and, as such, may offer a number of unique analytical insights. Our sample represents a general cross-section of local government officials at various levels in all three subnational jurisdictions. We draw interviewees from a variety of departments, including the environment, labor and social security, culture, and education. Each participant was interviewed at least once during the sampling period, but at least 1/3 of participants were interviewed by the researchers several times over a 3-year period, from 2014 to 2016. Section 2. Understanding incentives for innovation, using an evolutionary framework. Previous studies have noted the adaptability of the Communist Party of China, CPC, in responding to governance challenges as the key mechanism behind authoritarian resilience, especially in the economic reform era. Despite these studies, scholars debate the origins of this adaptability at the local level, where officials work in a hierarchical bureaucracy and in the presence of strong corporatist state. This is the gap in existing research he directly addresses. Existing literature on local experimentation in China and cadre incentives more broadly contend that local innovation occurs because the central government signals that it is desired in a certain policy area, and the evaluation system for promotion, the target responsibility management system, ties innovation to career advancement. Other scholars argue that solving local problems motivates experimentation. Regardless of this distinction, these arguments often implicitly assume that officials care about local needs due to promotion incentives, and that they innovate due to central signals. However, these approaches assume homogeneous preferences on the part of local officials, and therefore cannot fully explain the multitude of cases where local actors behave counter to these predictions, such as in cases where local officials act against central signals or violate direct orders. Indeed, Howman et al. Found that out of 53 pilots of high technology zones, 39 cases suggests medium to very high functional deviation, or variation from the intended programs and goals. Other scholars find similar deviation from central commands and argue the capture and conversion of institutions at the local level. This puzzle is mirrored in the general literature on endogenous institutional change, where gradual changes in institutions or policies are difficult to explain using equilibrium models, assuming homogeneous interests for all actors. To address this challenge, scholars have made two key ontological shifts. First, they have developed a more explicit theory of agency, and second, they have posited a more interactive theory of change focused on the constant endogenous interaction of rule makers and rule takers. This literature specifies a number of mechanisms by which rule takers, in this case local officials, might change the functioning of institutions, leading to unexpected variation in outcomes. As Hacker points out, those that seek to change an existing policy framework must ask two key questions. How easily can they achieve their goals within the existing framework? And how costly would it be to replace existing institutions with new ones? In authoritarian contexts, rulemakers face fewer costs in replacing existing institutions, a fact that explains the overriding on top-down decisions regarding replacement. The creation of entirely new institutions, or layering, the addition of new institutional rules and mandates on top of existing institutions. In contrast, rule takers face prohibitive costs to creating new rules, so they must work within existing constraints, leaving them with two strategies of drift and conversion. Drift refers to a strategy of essentially doing nothing until shifts in socioeconomic conditions render an institution irrelevant to current conditions. And at the more active end of the spectrum occurs when rule takers actively seek to shift the basic functions, goals, and operation of existing institutions. As Hacker explains, adaptation through conversion reflects the reality that most institutions or policies allow actors working within their constraints to pursue multiple ends. Thus, actors tasked with policy implementation may seek to reinterpret rules to suit their own goals and objectives within the constraints of the space available for adaptation. The advances made by scholars working on endogenous institutional change facilitated the development of adapting evolutionary frameworks for use in the social sciences. With an explicit focus on how agents with varying initial preferences interact with selection mechanisms to result in different outcomes over time, an evolutionary framework allows us to analyze how local officials interact with changing central signals about innovation given other factors in their environments. We use an evolutionary framework to examine how variation in officials' preferences for innovation interacts with selection mechanisms to influence policy experimentation outcomes. We find that significant selection mechanisms to be the promotion system, local pressure to respond to governance problems, and peer learning through communities of practice. Importantly, this approach does not assume homogeneous preferences on the part of local officials and allows more of an explicit focus on the causes of variation. Section 3. Innovation under Re-Centralization. In this special issue, Zuelian Chen describes how the new governance model under Xi Jinping, a top-level design, has constrained or even eliminated the space for bottom-up policy innovation, although this experimentation has always occurred within certain constraints. Our qualitative fieldwork supports this as well, as Chen and Gobel's empirical findings, in that we found a reduction in the reported policy experimentation in all three subnational jurisdictions since Xi Jinping took office in 2013. We surmise, as many of the interviewees attest in all three jurisdictions, that this is due to greater scrutiny of the activities of local policymakers, viz. The anti-corruption mass campaign, and an attempted re-centralization of political power. These result in a perception by local policy officials that the central government is signaling they want to restrict the space for innovation, and thus the perceived risk of experimentation for local officials has increased dramatically. An example of this signaling is the local officials below the provincial level report a substantial increase in the need to file work reports to supervisors, who are primarily concerned with meeting new guidelines for central supervision under the system of requesting instructions and submitting reports, as Zuelian Chen also notes in her article in this special issue. This has ultimately led to a perception of greater risk to innovate at the local level, in what one county-level official described as a work report culture. Although the official was actively engaged in policy experimentation previously, she/he complained that there was no longer any time to analyze problems and develop solutions, but instead was encouraged to focus on constantly filing work reports with supervisors. Another interviewee stated, now that the central government has focused more on implementation loyalty, lower-level governments must constantly report upward, creating huge workloads that leave them no time to reflect, only time to implement and report. So nothing, policy experimentation, is done deeply or sustainably. The necessity to file work reports represents a protection strategy on the part of local officials in response to the anti-corruption campaign, and further reflects the re-centralization of central power through top-level design, where local officials are viewed as implementing central policies rather than developing local policies to fit their environment. When policy changes by rule makers at the central level are clearly filtering down to affect local policy officials' behavior, there still exists a great deal of variation, with some localities experimenting in different policy areas, but not officially reporting policy experiments in progress, and others focusing more on improving existing policies than devising entirely new ones. In fact, we find three primary sources of variation due to 1. The ineffective the vertical reward and punishment system operated by the party state, 2. Differing base preferences of local officials, and 3. The presence of a cohort effect vis-a-vis communities of practice. Source of variation: ineffective vertical Primarily, we find that the cadre evaluation system does not incentivize similar behavior for a majority of local officials. Scholars who study Chinese bureaucracy traditionally use the cadre evaluation system as a proxy for officials' interests, since we know that cadres pay attention to these if they want promotions or bonuses. The target management responsibility system consists of a set of performance criteria that align local officials' behavior with the preferences of the center. Subnational officials are evaluated regularly using the system, which uses economic local GDP and public goods provision to evaluate cadre performance and determine promotions and raises. Local officials, whether concerned about career advancement or security, or theorized to be incentivized to implement policies or design experimental pilots that might score points on the evaluation, and innovation itself earns points. Yet, when we look at the scope conditions under which this evaluation system exerts control over officials' behavior, we find that some, but not all outcomes, can be explained in this manner. Indeed, local officials' decision-making process is much more complex, which our interviews reinforced. The analytical challenge is how to discuss incentives in the system in such a manner that it reduces complexity, but still captures the motivations of those in the system. As discussed below, the vertical control mechanisms of punishment through the anti-campaign and reward through the annual evaluation system for local officials are difficult to use effectively, especially at lower levels of government. Additionally, in contradistinction to the way promotion is discussed in the literature, most officials remain in their birth province for their entire years, rather than being promoted to the central government, and thus respond more to local governance challenges when developing experimental policies than to vertical control mechanisms. For example, Yu and Gao find that upwards of 70% of surveyed officials in Zhejiang report they know a position fairly early in their careers. So this divides them into higher position seeking and status quo categories, where the latter might focus more on local needs. Even for officials who do want higher positions, most are promoted within the same province, which also focuses them more on local needs than central mandates. In addition, the social networks in which local officials are embedded in their birth province reinforce an incentive to pay more attention to local needs rather than central mandates. This suggests, in sum, that the majority of local officials are ceilinged native officials and know from an early stage in their careers that they are not participating in a leadership tournament. Thus, the incentive provided by the evaluation system is not as strong as it is for the minority of officials positioned to advance to higher level positions outside of their birth province. Similarly, many officials in our sample do not strive for promotion, since this could actually be either a lateral transfer or even perceived as a demotion from the perspective of local cadres. For example, from a richer to poorer intra-province county, bigger office to a smaller one. Even for local officials who desire to be promoted, the evaluation system is complex, with hundreds of indicators for success. For example, in one county, officials are measured across 19 fields with 100 points assigned in each, and each field is composed of subfields. In total, the evaluation in this county consisted of approximately 1,000 items. The points in a given policy field reveal its political significance, but these fields are weighted differently across municipalities and provinces. In fact, Zhang and Ang find that promotion targets are assigned by multiple levels of government, and these targets may contradict one another. Moreover, the criteria for determining violations in the supposedly critical category of veto targets are often ambiguous, thus providing room for arbitrary interpretation and selective punishment. This is similar to the negative incentives of the anti-corruption campaign, insofar punishment is uncertain and seemingly arbitrary, and in turn makes it difficult for officials to know how to respond. In short, local officials do not believe that vertical incentives like the cadre evaluation scores alone directly determine promotion decisions, but instead that evaluation scores can be interpreted as a signal of upper-level government policy priorities. In this special issue, Qi Mei and Xiaonan Wang present empirical evidence illustrating the complexities of the determinants for promotion, as far as it is possible to identify distinct and lasting patterns. They do not find much support for the hypothesis that innovation leads to promotion, although cadres who create experimental economic policies have a tendency to get promoted more quickly. They do not find a similar pattern with other types of innovation and thus argue that this is not a large incentive for risk-taking. In the face of such an opaque and complex system, we should expect significant variations in local officials' behavior towards policy innovation and experimentation across regions and by level of government, as multiple paths and a great deal of uncertainty exists in this incentive system. Source of variation: differing pace preferences. Second, we find that individual level factors, such as having an innovative personality or preference for innovation, create variations in local officials' willingness to experiment. Studies of business leaders and government officials typically use psychological testing to create profiles of policy entrepreneurs. And these profiles in aggregate form define an innovative personality that tries to identify the individuals more likely to experiment or change policy. For example, King and Roberts identify 3 key characteristics in those who are likely to innovate: a particular interpersonal style, expression of power, and actualization of higher order values and ideals. Similarly, in another study, we exploit new data from a survey of local officials to develop a typology of personality characteristics and preferences, and find a significant amount of variation in the preferences of local officials for innovation. This evidence implies that certain types of leaders are more likely to innovate even in high-risk settings, and shows how substantial variation in local policy experimentation throughout China is determined, at least in part, by the individual personality characteristics and agency of local leaders. Due to the amount of local discretion found in China's governance system, Allers et al. Further find that individual preferences for innovation matter a great deal, by illustrating that the dynamics of the internal policy coordination process were strongly conditioned by the leadership style of the county party secretaries and their respective policy preferences. This base preference to experiment with policy to find solutions to problems is observed in the empirical pattern of policy champions found in China, where officials champion selected experimental policies when rotated to another post. In this way, policy experiments are diffused through the career movements of individuals, rather than only the spread of ideas. One interviewee recounted the experiences of a local mayor who, after being transferred into his new position, wanted to implement the same policy experiments he had created in his last post, but faced challenges in doing so due to opposition from local officials. The interviewee explained that this normative isomorphic practice is a common behavior among local officials, who seek to bring former policy experiments with them to new positions. Also, in this special issue, Zhejiang Ma and Rosemary Peng find that agents' preferences matter the most when it comes to the choice to adopt direct elections in townships as a solution to the governance challenge of the loss of local tax revenue. This decision was influenced more by local governance challenges than promotion concerns, as innovative cadres were not promoted more quickly in all cases, and that the personal preferences of these cadres were the most important determinant for adopting direct elections. The personal nature of policy experimentation is further evident by tracing the process of policy diffusion, where scholars find that these cases of innovation are developed by individual officials in response to governance problems and often persist even in the face of central sanctions. For example, in the case of policy experiments that created the minimum livelihood guarantee, The central government was not interested in such innovation, and instead, this experiment was advocated by Minister Duoji Kareng of the Ministry of Civil Affairs in response to his perception of poverty as a major challenge to social stability. I would argue that Duoji was not motivated by what might be called rational self-interest or a ministry-building tendency. A more likely alternative motivation are pragmatic concerns born of increasing urban poverty and enterprise reform. Duoji drew a clear ideological connection between socialism, the legitimacy of the party, and the MLG. As the highlights, policy experimentation is often driven by preferences for innovation on the part of individual officials, rule takers, even in the face of central rule makers sanctioning or disinterest, and therefore serves as a source of variation when studying how local officials respond to a more or less open environment for policy innovation created by the central government. Local officials with preferences for innovation might continue experimenting despite explicit or implicit commands to desist from upper-level government. Source of variation: communities of practice. Third and finally, our fieldwork reveals the importance of communities of practice as a source of variation. A community of practice consists of members whose shared ways of doing and approaching things generate mutual ideas, tools, routines, that capture the accumulated knowledge of the community. In other words, knowledge gained through professional networks or cohorts shapes how local officials understand the costs and benefits of policy experimentation, as recent empirical evidence from China reinforces. In his contribution to this special issue, Liang Ma finds that this community is an important mechanism for policy experimentation and diffusion of existing innovations. In analyzing the diffusion of the public bike program pioneered in Zhejiang province, he finds that site visits by other like-minded policymakers significantly increased the likelihood of policy adoption. When explaining why officials use information from their own networks more than other sources of information, interviewees suggested that the complexity of the evaluation process creates multiple paths for advancement, and the uncertainty of what leads to success is such that network information matters more. In short, it is local policymakers' perceived performance relative to peers that is prized most for career prospects. This evidence reveals the importance of horizontal comparison and peer/normative isomorphism as a source of variation in officials' behavior, which we also observe with the diffusion of local innovation. When describing how they designed a policy experiment, interviewed officials describe a process of learning about a new policy solution to an existing problem through their personal networks, and then informally conducting a study tour and adapting that policy experiment to their local context. For example, one interviewee discussed how the Zhejiang party secretary, Xia Balang, wanted to create policy experiments around environmental such as water, when he was moved there from his previous post in Tianjin. Seoul is a sister city to Hangzhou and has had a number of exchanges with local officials about how to improve water quality after pollution from the dyeing industry. Chia learned from these exchanges how to create a green technology economy, like the water treatment plants developed in South Korea, that he then implemented in Zhejiang. Qiang Xin, in this special issue, finds a similar process in play when looking at the low-carbon city innovative policy developed by Baoding in Hebei province. Building on insights from the literatures on communities of practice and experimentalist governance, we find that one particular local government agency perpetuated changes in local governance that were responsible for the policy innovation. This agency engaged in professional community building with actors across different organization boundaries, with agency bureaucrats creating and embedding themselves in professional societies and expert communities that encompassed other extra-local and non-state actors. This led to a distinct form of governance, where local policy making and implementation were taking place within this social space, which these bureaucrats referred to as a professional community or circle. Rather than viewing local governance as its own prerogative and power, it was instead enacted through a set of joint institutional practices and mechanisms, together with a new set of professional peers. The authors in this special issue see a significant amount of learning via a communities of practice in the environmental and social policy areas. Section 4. Implications for Innovation. Our findings have theoretical and practical implications for policy innovation and experimentation in China. Although we find that the evaluation system can incentivize local officials, rule takers, to implement policies desired by the central government, rule makers, it does this more acutely for a small number of upwardly mobile officials. In addition, the complexities and nuances of the evaluation system often lead to local via a communities of practice to navigate the system. In other words, the ability of the central government to control local officials' decisions to experiment with policy is limited, and more significant factors are local pressure to respond to governance problems, imitating peers' innovations, and individual preferences for innovation. We find that these factors influence the likelihood of policy experimentation more than the institutional changes at the central level. Or perhaps a better way of explaining this is that these factors filter institutional changes to result in variation at the local level. As such, we find strong support for an evolutionary process predicated on individual preferences interacting with institutional incentives such as the evaluation system and the networked structure of cadre. Now, at a practical level, despite the high risks and uncertain rewards currently experienced in the Xi Jinping era, many local officials who either have a strong personal desire for experimentation, innovative personalities, or work in areas with governance threats like social instability, are more likely to continue policy experimentation. In fact, during the more conservative periods of the Hu Wen administration, such as during the Beijing Olympics in 2008, we still observed policy experimentation. However, these experiments might be on a smaller scale, might focus only in certain policy areas, and might only be discussed in local networks. This change might be beneficial from a governance perspective if it reduces innovation, used simply as a promotion strategy, or those using innovation as a cover for reputation building projects or corruption. As one interviewee pointed out, many local officials do not try to learn from other experiments, but want to take credit for being innovative. Therefore, policy experiments were not always a gradual process of improving governance. Similarly, Jesper Schegler and Matthias Stepin find in their article in this special issue that innovations in e-government are not sustained due to less attention on users, citizens, than supervisors, and the behaviors incentivized in the cadre evaluation system, namely innovation, not sustainability. Again, those likely to continue to experiment are those who care about solving local problems, or who have innovative personalities. A potential negative consequence of this might be that the experiments will not be advertised outside the local network, which would to evaluate and diffuse these experiments throughout China. This might mean that potential solutions to government problems remain trapped at the local level, and that the central government will lose this adaptable governance mechanism that has contributed to its regime durability and successful economic development in the post-market reform era. More broadly, from the perspective of good governance, this disconnect between the local and central levels might create the ossification that afflicted the former Soviet Union, but it is unclear if Xi Jinping views this as a significant, as he has interpreted it collapse as due to failure to use enough repression rather than a failure of governance. Policy experimentation under previous regimes often addressed difficult governance challenges for China, and it remains to be seen if Xi will recognize these benefits and its style of centralized control to allow for some more local autonomy. This seems unlikely, at least in the short term, as he views local autonomy as the core governance problem, leading to poor implementation of central laws and endemic corruption. Without change, we would expect increasingly disconnected responses to shared governance challenges between central and local governments that will likely result in increasing problems in policy areas requiring more comprehensive solutions, such as food and drug safety or environmental policy. These are difficult problems to address solely at a central or local level without coordination and purely top-down policies relying on administrative control mechanisms to force local compliance are expensive and often less effective.